HSPs need a lot of downtime. It's not because we're lazy. It's not because we're not being productive. It's because of our heightened awareness of everything. Think about that. Like when everything is coming at you all the time and you can perceive it, that's a lot on your nervous system. Welcome to the Collective Healers Podcast, a place for sensitive souls who want to use science and spirituality to live in mind, body, spirit harmony. I'm your host, Christina Bentel. I'm an intuitive energy guide, splenic projector with a 1-3 profile, an INFJ, and an empath. I'm here to help you learn how to holistically heal and transform so you can fully embrace your spiritual potential. Whether you're a seasoned healer, a curious soul, or someone seeking more harmony in your life, I'm glad the universe has brought us together because you're in the right place. The subject of being a highly sensitive person or being traumatized has come up a couple of times in the past few weeks, and I've been wanting to talk about this because I think it's so important on your growth journey. I grew up being told that I was too sensitive. I grew up in a household that was more masculine, so my emotions didn't have a place in that environment because they weren't understood. I was the girly one, I was the sensitive one, I was the emotional one. Part of what I have recently been learning and understanding is how trauma crosses over with being sensitive. So in this episode, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the science of both of them, the biology of trauma and the biology of being sensitive, but also understanding where they cross over, but where they're different, and practical tips for you to embrace your sensitivity and heal in your journey. So one of the things that I noticed about myself very early on in life is I always felt different. I reacted to everything differently. When I'm talking about being sensitive, I am sensitive in literally every sense of the word. I am sensitive to food. I am sensitive to heat. I am sensitive to sunlight. Everything from the lotion that I put on my skin, the makeup that I wear, even my digestion is very sensitive. That's because my biology is different. And one of the things that I know for a fact is that when you're sensitive, you are far more prone to trauma. And that's what makes it hard to really distinguish, is it trauma or is it sensitivity? Because especially when we're stuck in that place where we have a lot of unresolved trauma, we don't yet know how to understand, is this a sensitivity or is this a trauma response? And I'm hoping by the end of this episode that I can give you the right information and tools. So not only can you distinguish between the two, but you can start to embrace your sensitivity and use this to start to heal some of that unresolved trauma. First, I think it's most important to talk about how trauma changes your brain and your body. And this is something that we don't talk enough about. Trauma, especially developmental trauma that happens early in life and childhood, it alters your brain structure. Like it literally changes your brain structure, specifically your amygdala, which is the part of your brain that is responsible for fear. It also can impact your hippocampus, which is part of making memories. And it impacts your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for things like decision making, emotional control, impulse control, and even executive functioning. So these changes in your brain structure, they directly impact how you perceive the world. Like think about it. If your amygdala grows in volume, this is the fear center of your brain, you're more reactive to things because your body doesn't feel as safe, and you feel anxiety and you feel fear more often than not. These changes in your brain, they change how you process emotions and how you react to stress. It's evolutionary. So what's happening is because we go through the trauma, our brain and our body adjust in ways that it perceives that is keeping us safe. Trauma impacts your body stress response, which can lead to an overactive HPA axis. This is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This results in increased production of stress hormones like cortisol. Cortisol running through your system for long periods of time can lead to chronic anxiety, fatigue, and so many health issues. All of these changes also lead to impaired memory, impaired concentration. So what happens is trauma, it disrupts your brain's ability to store and retrieve memories effectively because of the way your synapses and your brain is working. This is what can lead to those intrusive thoughts and those flashbacks being problematic when you have trauma. The biggest thing that I think that people don't understand with trauma is that it literally, it changes your brain and body so much that it leads to a lot of dysfunction and it makes you physically sick. And when you don't heal that trauma in your biology, it creates a ripple effect and it keeps mounting, it keeps growing. It's like a snowball until you stop the snowball. But unfortunately, what's happening in Western medicine is that we're putting Band-Aids on the symptoms. But the problem keeps getting worse because we haven't addressed the root cause, which is the unresolved trauma that's impacting our biology. So when you have trauma, you've got prolonged stress, you've got heightened inflammation because of the cortisol running through your system. It can lead to a lot of physical problems like heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders. Because what happens is your body's immune system becomes compromised, and it makes it really difficult to fight off illnesses. You probably get sick more often, along with your chronic fatigue, your chronic pain. All of this it's the puzzle pieces of trauma that until we start to understand how they all play a part in our overall health and that mind-body-spirit connection, can't truly heal. The other piece that I want to talk about are emotional and behavioral changes. And I didn't really comprehend this for a long time, even years and years of therapy. Trauma leads to changes in your ability to emotionally regulate. It changes your behavior because what happens is your brain and your body thinks that you're constantly under pressure. It thinks that you're going to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger because our biology has not caught up to our outside world. Our evolutionary traits that kept us alive when we were going to be eaten by a tiger are the same traits that are trying to keep us alive now. But what happens is it goes to the extreme of trying to keep us alive. The reaction that we have doesn't necessarily reflect the outside. So the inside isn't necessarily matching the outside, but our body doesn't know that yet. So what happens is you can become extremely volatile. Your emotions are all over the place. You can become extremely sad and upset and angry and all of these emotions because that fluctuation in your emotions and your behavior is directly related to the changes that trauma has created in your brain and your body. And unfortunately, what happens with many people is we develop maladaptive coping mechanisms. It can be substance abuse. Maybe it's alcohol or drugs. It could be self-harm. It could be social withdrawal. And these are things that we may inherently feel like there's something wrong with us and that we are broken and that we can't understand these pieces of ourselves when it's actually unresolved trauma that's trapped in the body. So all of these things create more sensitivity in your body. Your body becomes more hyper aware of everything around it because it's trying to keep you safe. So what are the outcomes of this sensitivity that are manifesting from trauma specifically? It's a heightened emotional response. You might have really strong reactions to seemingly minor events. Like, do you blow up when something goes wrong? And then later you're like, why did I get so angry? Because it wasn't really that was a small thing. So then, of course, the big things, you lose it. The other piece is hypervigilance. So we often get overly alert to potential threats because we're constantly scanning. Our brain is always on the lookout. That means we can be hyperactive to a door slamming behind us, the noises of things that are happening because we're looking for threats. It leads to constant anxiety and a heightened startle response. So do you startle really easily? The other piece is that it can lead to physical sensitivity. So physical pain in your gut and your stomach, the food that you eat. Yep, I didn't realize for a long time. A lot of my sensitivity, my gut issues were actually trauma. It can also lead to physical sensations in your nervous systems being overactivated and things just hurt. Do you struggle to wear certain socks because they rub the wrong way? That was always a big issue for me because I couldn't stand it. It physically hurt. Another thing with trauma is sensory overload. Because of our heightened sensitivity to input, just think about it. Your brain has become a beacon for danger, and it's danger, danger, danger everywhere. I think of that robot where it's danger, Will Robinson, danger. But your brain, it's funny, but it's not funny. Your brain is on the lookout. And when that happens, you get overwhelmed by loud noises, bright lights, crowded spaces, and you literally feel your body just getting overwhelmed, and it could lead to panic attacks. You can also have social sensitivity. You can be sensitive to social interactions, terrified of trusting people, feeling scared of social rejection and criticism. Yep, that was me for a long, long time. The other piece is this can lead to emotional numbness. In some cases where you become so overly sensitive, your body feels like it has no choice but to feel emotional withdrawal and complete detachment. So that's another layer. Everybody experiences a lot of these things differently, and how you experience them is unique to you. Not everyone will experience emotional numbness. You may feel it in certain areas and not others. I know that was true for me. In certain areas of my life, I would experience that emotional numbness, but not in others. The other piece of this is sensitivities to stress. When you have experienced trauma, you experienced traumatic stress running through your system, which has a direct impact on your hormones for however long, decades. For me, it was decades. So what happens is over time, your systems start to wear out. Think of it as a car. If you have the gas pedal jammed to the floor while you got the brake also jammed to the floor, what's going to happen? Things are going to break down. Eventually, something's going to give. So, what happens as you become an adult and you begin to go into the real world, your tolerance level, your threshold for stress gets smaller and smaller. Those things that mount up every single day, they become more overwhelming. It's kind of like having a bucket. Your bucket is constantly full of stuff, so you can't tolerate anything else going in. It doesn't matter how small it is. It's overwhelming and it's difficult to manage. And what does this do? All of these things lead to sleep disturbances. So when we have trauma, we are sensitive to disruptions in our sleep. We get insomnia, frequent nightmares, and all of that just exacerbates the emotional and physical sensitivities. Like, do you see the cycle that plays out here? It starts to layer and layer and layer. If this is the first time you're hearing all of this, or if you're feeling overwhelmed by hearing all of this, I want to tell you that this is exactly what I'm trying to teach in this world of when you start to understand this puzzle piece, you can start to focus on the puzzle pieces that can actually help you heal. And unfortunately, in Western medicine, what they're trying to do is, here, I'll give you a pill to help you sleep. Here, I'll give you a pill to help with your anxiety. Here, I'll give you a pill to help with your gut issues. You're putting band-aids on things that you're not actually addressing the root cause. And that's what keeps the cycle progressing and getting worse. I'm trying to get people to take a step back and see, like, hey, here's the list of all of these things that trauma does. Let's focus on working to release the energy of trauma in your biology. Because when you do that, you knock out 10 things at one time instead of focusing on one thing at a time. We're taking the long way to trauma healing. And by sharing all of this, I hope that I can give you hope of, like, there's a better way. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about, what does it mean to be a highly sensitive person? So if we take trauma out of this picture, let's imagine for a moment we're just focusing on what it means to be an HSP. So if you're not familiar with the term HSP is a phrase that was coined by Dr. Elaine Aron, who wrote a book on the highly sensitive person. If you have not explored those, I highly recommend them. That was kind of my first insight into understanding what it meant to be a highly sensitive person. So being an HSP means that you have a heightened sensitivity to stimuli. Stimulation can be external, it can be internal. It's also known as a sensory processing sensitivity, and it's estimated to affect about 15 to 20% of the population, which, by the way, I strongly suspect that many projectors in human design are also HSP. Projectors in human design represent about 20% of the population. I suspect there's a very strong overlap. Anyways, so what does it mean to be an HSP? By definition, this personality trait means that you deeply process things. We think more deeply about things, including our thoughts and our emotions. We have a very deep, rich inner world, which, by the way, I just thought everybody did. I really thought everybody had, like, this internal, like, beautiful, I don't even want to call it a monologue, but it's like seeing the beauty that surrounds us and art and music and insects and plants and color and all of these things. Like, that rich reflection is part of being an HSP. A gift that we have is that we reflect more on our experiences, but we can also become very easily overwhelmed with them if it becomes too much. Another trait of being an HSP is our strong emotional reaction. So as highly sensitive people, our emotions are really intense, but here's the cool thing. We feel both positive and negative emotions more deeply. It's kind of like a pendulum that swings both ways. And I always talk about this as the pendulum can only swing to the left as much as it can swing to the right. So when you have experienced deep levels of pain, sometimes we feel like that's all we can experience, but when you experience that level of pain, you have the ability to experience that level of joy and happiness, because the pendulum, by the law of duality, it must swing both ways. Do you feel a strong emotional reaction when you see art? Are you deeply moved by music and nature? These are traits of being a highly sensitive person. Again, this was something I just thought everybody else felt too. And I could understand why I would watch a movie and I would just be brought to tears so quickly, which, by the way, like, commercials can make me cry, like happy tears and sad tears, and in nature and all of these things. And I assumed everyone felt this deeply, but they don't. It's a special gift. Another part of being a highly sensitive person is our heightened sensory awareness. We are sensitive to physical stimulation, lights, sounds, smells, even textures. There are certain textures that just, nope, too much, can't do it. as I have learned to embrace my sensitivity, I realize that I love beautiful things. I love surrounding myself with smells that feel safe and supportive and textures like soft and comfortable. I like dimmed lights. I'm very cognizant of my sensory awareness now. I allow myself to nurture that, and I realize that it really fills my bucket in a lot of different ways. This is part of my personality that for a long time I would just pretend like, no, I don't need things to be nice and cozy and comfortable. Like, I guess I don't need them, but I love it and I enjoy it, and it really helps me. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean I'm materialistic. It doesn't mean anything about me except for that I enjoy things because of my heightened sensory awareness, and that's okay. As HSPs, we also are deeply empathetic and intuitive. A big part of this is because of the dynamic of our energy. And again, I don't have research on this, but I strongly suspect that many projectors are HSP because of the way projectors' aura shows up in this world. The aura of a projector is to receive and is to be able to interpret the energy around us. And we do this by having open energy centers. And a lot of it, being able to receive this energy is what makes us empathetic and being able to understand and easily sense the emotions of others. So we can feel a very deep sense of connection with the people around us, and we have a strong intuitive insights. But I will say that if you've struggled with trauma, your strong intuitive insights, you may be actively, I know I was for a long time, shoving them inside and saying, no, you're wrong. You can't be right because everyone else is right. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to distinguish the two between HSP and trauma, but that was one of them that I know was really big for me for a long time. HSPs need a lot of downtime. It's not because we're lazy. It's not because we're not being productive. It's because of our heightened awareness of everything. Think about that. Like when everything is coming at you all the time and you can perceive it, that's a lot on your nervous system. So we need time to recharge. We need quiet time after social interactions. Here's a good example. When you go to the grocery store, do you get in your car and just sit there for a moment, like and decompress before you take off? That's because you're balancing your energy to recover. Like we need time to regain our energy. And because we operate differently than other people, we can't necessarily keep up with the go, go, go. We don't have the same energy levels. We're not meant to do that in this world. And all of this plays into like our inherent ability to be like, we are very aware of subtleties in our environment. Do you notice small changes that other people overlook? You notice when there's a shift in a mood of somebody. You notice like minor details in your surroundings or subtle cues in conversations. There's a perfect example of my husband. How do I say this nicely? Okay, there was an example the other day where I'm leaning over looking at this butterfly and my husband just randomly starts to walk by and basically almost steps on the butterfly. And I'm like, two things. How do you not see that I'm looking at something right here? And how do you not notice that there's a beautiful butterfly right here? And I have to remind myself, like, he doesn't notice those things. And sometimes it can really upset me. And part of my trauma is there's more trauma wrapped around in that. But anyways, when we are highly sensitive, there are things that we notice and we just assume other people notice those things too. It can be really painful when we assume that everyone is on the same level, which leads to the next piece of we can be prone to overwhelm. Because we process information so deeply, because we think so deeply, because we are so reflective, because we are so highly aware of our surroundings, we can be easily overwhelmed. And especially in situations where there's too much stimuli, like busy crowds. Going to a concert, the last time I went to a concert, I'm like, I love music. I can do this. I'll be okay. After I left, I'm like, no, I'm never doing that again. I love music. I don't want crowds. When it becomes summertime, it can be really difficult because everyone's like, let's go to the festival. Let's go to the fireworks. And I'm like, I'm okay. Fireworks blowing up over my head while I'm surrounded by a crowd of people, not my idea of a good time at all. And I'm the minority in this. And I used to, for a long time, just give into it and do it. And it took a toll on my physical, my mental, and my emotional health. So let's talk about the next piece of this, the similarities and the differences of being highly sensitive and trauma. Like there are some things that overlap, but there are also some key differences. And that's what I really want to point out. So similarities. And when we talked about trauma, it can change your brain. So your amygdala can become more hyperactive and your emotional response become heightened because of the changes in your brain. Being highly sensitive, you have intense emotional reactions because of the way you're designed. Another piece is sensitivity to stimuli. So having trauma and being an HSP, both experience like sensitivity to physical stimulation. You get overwhelmed by lights, sounds, textures. You can get overwhelmed really easily. And both trauma survivors and HSPs need more downtime. Trauma survivors require more downtime to recharge because after social interactions, like everything has overstimulated our body and our nervous system. It's a similar type of overstimulation. The difference is in the core reason why it's happening. Another one is empathy, which I want to caveat a little bit because I think trauma survivors experience empathy at a very different level than HSPs. A person who has trauma may not feel that same level of empathy. They may feel the need to protect themselves by understanding what the other person is thinking and making accommodations accordingly and adjusting their behavior accordingly. With a person that's highly sensitive, that empathetic feeling goes deeper. As a sensitive person is truly being able to put yourself in another person's shoes and being able to understand what they're experiencing. So I want to take a moment to mention that this episode is being sponsored by the Aligned Living Program with the Collective Healers. This is a 6-week program to guide your journey of mind, body, spirit harmony for heart-centered entrepreneurs. So if you're an entrepreneur who's struggling to find balance between your business and your personal well-being, or you want deeper spiritual connection and healing, or you're feeling overwhelmed and out of sync with your life's purpose, this program is designed for you. We will weave together the science of trauma healing and lessons on deepening your spiritual awakening. And you'll be working with me, so I would love to see you there. All you have to do is click the link in the show notes or visit thecollectivehealers.com to enroll today. So here's something that is so important to understand. I want to talk about the differences between trauma and being highly sensitive. If you get anything out of this episode, I truly want it to be this, a differentiation between trauma and being highly sensitive, because I think so many people that are highly sensitive are living in their trauma and they're not allowing themselves to embrace the beauty and their gift of their sensitivity, which I believe can lead to so much healing. The biggest differences with these two is the origin of the sensitivity. For HSPs, our heightened sensitivity is an inherent trait present from birth. We're sensitive babies. We come out of the womb sensitive. Our DNA is structured for us to be sensitive. It's a natural part of our personality and our sensory processing. In contrast, though, trauma-related sensitivity develops as after you experience traumatic events, developmental trauma, childhood trauma. So what happens is you learn how to respond out of perceived threats. Another difference is triggers and how we respond. So trauma survivors have specific triggers that typically elicit strong emotional reactions. And if you have developmental trauma, you can have a lot of triggers, because I certainly did. And I had a lot of triggers that were related to how I was treated by my parents. So because of my sensitivity, I did not... authority figures were very difficult for me. Relationships were really difficult for me because I didn't like confrontation. All of these things, it was like I was in constant trigger. I was being constantly triggered. And it was like my life was an entire trauma response just linked over 38 years until I finally learned how to release them. So for trauma, when you have trauma, you have flashbacks, panic attacks, disassociation. On the other hand, being sensitive, we react more strongly to stimulation in general. It's not related to something more specific, like an outcome. And this can be really hard, especially if you're in the very beginning of unresolved trauma and you're healing. But as you progress, like this will become more apparent. Like you'll be able to find moments of rest and digest and restore, where you notice like, okay, like I can embrace being sensitive. So understanding the roots of all of things can really help you start to understand which parts of your personality might be trauma or it's the sensitivity. Being an HSP and being a trauma survivor both really impact your life, and we can both be easily overwhelmed and get burnt out because we operate differently. Trauma heavily impacts your relationships and your overall well-being. Being sensitive is more about overstimulation as you work to find ways to improve your self-care and listen to your body. With HSPs, it can be different because it's about managing our sensitivity without allowing so much disruption in our life. So the key question, how do you really distinguish your sensitivity from trauma responses? The biggest one is being aware. So awareness of triggers. Are you able to identify specific triggers? This will help you really distinguish between the two. Trauma responses are linked to specific memories or experiences. And here's the thing too with trauma. You may not remember the memory. You may not remember the specific words or the time or the place or anything like that. And quick side note, you don't have to in order to be able to heal trauma, no matter what Western medicine tries to tell you. That's a whole different story. Okay. So, but being aware of the triggers for me, this has been tuning into the feeling that I get with situations. When I started to become aware of my triggers, I started looking for the patterns. For example, work was always a big one with me because I couldn't struggle with authority figures. Starting at a micro level, I did not like doing things that I didn't want to do. So I'll give you a really good example. I was in a job one time. I had a lot of experience in my marketing career, and I was in charge of a camera. They put me in charge literally because, they're like the marketing department. The camera belongs to the marketing department. So you're in charge of making sure it gets checked out, making sure it has batteries, making sure that I wipe the photos off and get the photos to the people. And I'm like, in my mind, I don't even think I said the words at this time, but I'm like, this is beneath me. I have far more skills. Like, you should be appreciating me. But my trauma response has always been the freezer fawn. So of course I didn't say any of these things. I was just very passive aggressive. I was very angry, and I'm like, I don't want to do this. So I would get very, very angry. Like, no, this is beneath. I don't want to do it. Oh, well, of course I did it. I still did it, but I didn't want to do it. So I started to realize how that would show up in my life of when I was being asked to do things that I did not want to do because I felt like I had more value than that. Those things triggered me. Then I started kind of going up from there. Bosses would trigger me, and I couldn't yet figure out why, but I knew the feeling of having to talk to a boss was triggering. I tuned into that feeling, and then I'm like, okay, where else is this feeling popping up? It's with authority figures. Time I would be in place of an authority figure, that same feeling would come up. As I started to understand those triggers, I started to link them together. Eventually, I started to realize I struggle with authority figures because I was scared of my parents. I was scared for my safety. I was scared for my emotional well-being. I was terrified. So I felt like I had to be invisible all the time. Like, that does incredibly crazy things to your psyche. And as I began to heal and I started to work on embracing my safety on an emotional, physical level, I started to release that. And that, by the way, is more of what we teach in the Aligned Living program. Another side note. But becoming aware of those triggers, because once you start to delineate like what's triggering you, then you can start to see that's overwhelming me because of my general sensory overload of things that are coming at me at 1,000 miles per hour in all directions. So another way to distinguish your sensitivity from a trauma response is your physical symptoms. So physical symptoms of trauma responses are typically like heart palpitations, sweating, shaking, that intense anxiety, like that impending doom. When it comes to your sensitivity, it's more of a discomfort. It's overstimulation and it's overwhelm. But it's not that same intense physical reaction that you have with trauma. Another difference is emotional patterns. Reflect on your emotional patterns because they can give you so much insight. Trauma responses typically include intense fear, anger, and sadness. They're linked to your past history. Feel that in your body. You're going to notice that those feelings come up. Is it fear, anger, sadness? So when you're highly sensitive, it's a broader range of emotions that are more deep, but they're not really tied to past emotions. They're moments of this moment. They're more present or more broad. When you have trauma and you've been living with anxiety and depression and overwhelm for a long time, your predominant emotions are going to be like that amygdala, which is running the show, which is the fear, anger, and the sadness. When you're living more in your sensitivity and you're healing your trauma, you're going to experience a more breadth of emotions, and you're going to be more aware of those emotions because they're not going to be so intense and right in your face. It's going to feel more natural and fluid. So really understanding the distinctions between what could be your trauma response and what could be your sensitivity response can really empower you to honor your sensitivity. I grew up feeling like my sensitivity was a weakness. I did not like it. I did not want to be sensitive. We live in a generator society that is very masculine. Have you heard Darwin's theory of evolution? In my darkest of days, I told myself that I was not meant to live. I was not meant to survive because my sensitive nature, my body, all of these things, that was my story before I went into the hospital, was that I'm not meant to be here because I can't cope, I can't survive in this environment. But as I have healed and I have learned and I have grown, and especially as my spiritual awakening has started to blossom, I recognize now that my sensitivity is a gift that is meant to help this collective further awaken. It is a gift that comes with a lot of pain because we live in a density that is full of pain, and sensitivity can bring a lot of pain in this life. But once we learn to heal it, it becomes a massive, massive gift. That's part of this place that we're at in our world right now, is there's a lot of people that are highly sensitive that are still living in the trauma, that are still living in the heaviness. And I want to teach you how to release that heaviness so you can embrace the sensitivity. I know that our sensitive nature is here for a reason. It is here to help us to be guides to this world, to help heal this world. We are unique for a reason. Nothing happens by accident. There are no coincidences. The universe has gave this planet sensitive souls as part of this next step of awakening and evolution. I believe that we are here to play a massive role in the next stage of this collective awakening. And we can't do that as long as we are still living in a place of trauma and the trauma cycles. My hope is that by listening through this episode, you can really start to understand where you may still be holding on to some trauma, but also where you may be able to further embrace your sensitivity and allow that to be a beautiful, amazing, and wonderful thing in your life, because it truly is a gift. Maybe 20% of this population understands what it's like to be able to look at the sunset and be in pure awe. Embrace that. Embrace all of the pieces that come along with that, because we have been so conditioned to believe that sensitivity is a weakness that we fail to see the strength in it. And I want you to see the beauty and the strength in your sensitivity, because when we stop trying to live like the other 80%, that's when we thrive. The longer we stay conditioned and the longer we try to fit into a mold in which we are not designed to fit, the more we will continue to suffer and the further our health will deteriorate. So as we wrap this up, I want to share some practical tips that can help you to begin to embrace your sensitive nature. And the first one, create a calm and safe environment. This is one that I cannot even begin to tell you how much it helps. When you have a quiet, clutter-free space and you prioritize your home for relaxation and recharging, it makes a world of difference. Do you enjoy soft lighting, calming colors, gentle scents? Do the things that help to create that soothing atmosphere for you. If you have children, you're a mom with children, I know that sometimes this can be difficult. If you're able to designate a space and ask your family to support your boundaries of this is your calm space, and you have a space that is for you. The other thing is practicing mindfulness and meditation. If meditation is a huge piece of staying grounded and present. When we have trauma or we are disconnected from our body because of our body trying to protect itself, it disconnects from the brain-body connection. Mindfulness can help to heal this connection. It can also help you to embrace your sensitive nature as you allow yourself to experience it more presently and more fully. I highly recommend meditation techniques that focus on the breath and body. It will help you reinforce that mind-body connection. Next is setting healthy boundaries. When we have trauma, boundaries can be extremely, extremely difficult. It was one of the things that I learned early on in my trauma healing journey because I didn't have boundaries. I was taught as a child that boundaries meant that you didn't love someone. And that story became my inner narrative that boundaries were bad. But I want to tell you that boundaries are the ultimate act of self-care. So learn to say no to activities or commitments that feel overwhelming. Honor your energy levels and do your best to communicate your needs clearly with your friends and your family and your colleagues. You also need to make sure you prioritize self-care. And I know that this one can be difficult too. One of the things that I learned growing up with self-care is selfish. And I don't know where that narrative ever came from because it is it's crazy, right? When you're on an airplane, they tell you to put your oxygen mask on first because you can't help someone else if you are not okay. So if you're constantly self-sacrificing, it's time to stop. Schedule regular downtime to relax and rejuvenate. Make sure you're engaging in activities that nourish you, mind, body, and soul. Do you love reading? Make time for it. Go on nature walks. Be creative. Do the things that help nurture you. Another thing to learn about is practicing emotional regulation. This is, I think, a huge one in our society in general because we are not taught this as children, and most of the time, we don't talk about it as adults. Learning to process and understand your emotions is really important. When we are disconnected from our emotions, we are disconnected from what's going on in our inner world. It creates a lot of volatility. So practice emotional regulation, getting in touch with your body, understanding what's happening in your body. When you feel escalated and you feel overwhelmed, work on understanding how you come down from that. How do you calm your nervous system during stressful situations? By the way, that's a step of healing the biological impact of trauma on your body. Another thing you can do is connect with like-minded individuals. Join support groups or communities for highly sensitive people, which, by the way, we are growing a community for sensitive souls over at thecollectivehealers.com. So if you're looking for connection, I highly recommend you come check it out. Because when you can connect with like-minded individuals, you can share your experiences and coping strategies. And it's so incredibly validating when you can be around people that understand you. Next is make sure you keep educating yourself. Read more books and articles about being highly sensitive so you can better understand your traits. Again, if you haven't read Dr. Elaine Aron's book, The Highly Sensitive Person, she has a couple of different books. I would highly recommend those to start. And if you can, and if you feel safe and comfortable, you can educate your loved ones about what it means to be highly sensitive. They may or may not be receptive. I will tell you from my personal experience, when I found out that I was highly sensitive, I shared it with my family, and it didn't go as well as I would have hoped. But that was part of my trauma. It depends on where you're at in your journey and the people that are in your life. But if you are able to share it with the people that are around you, I completely support that. And if you're not able to, again, going back to my last point, find people that understand you, because it is incredibly important as part of your journey of being sensitive to help you embrace this part of yourself, to find people that fully support you as being your unique sensitive self. Another thing that's important, and I think it's often overlooked, is limit your exposure to things that stress you out, including news, books, media, anything that is distressing. You're allowed to remove it from your life. And that does not mean that you don't care. It doesn't mean that you are being ignorant about the world events. It does not mean that you care less about something. It's, again, goes back to putting your oxygen mask on first. If you watch the news and you become so distressed that you can't sleep at night, and then you wake up in the morning and then you're too stressed to even get to work because you're sick to your stomach, is that helping anyone? There are all kinds of things that, being highly sensitive, we try to force ourselves to do, even though we know that it's not good for us. And I want to start to tell you, set these boundaries, limit exposure to things that don't feel good, because when you are not able to take care of yourself, you're not able to show up in a healthy way in this world. So 2 more things that I really want to recommend as practical tips for you as a highly sensitive person to fully embrace your nature is foster your creative outlets. Find ways to experience the beauty and the things that helped you to express your emotions and to relieve stress. Because as you align with this creative part of yourself and you start to experience more beauty in the world, you start to bring that sensitivity to the surface. And lastly, practice self-compassion and self-acceptance. Self-compassion is number 1 most advantageous thing you can do in your healing journey. When you practice self-compassion, you're giving yourself permission to be human, to be flawed, to be imperfect. So I want you to embrace your sensitivity as a unique and valuable trait, and be kind to yourself and acknowledge your strengths and contributions. I hope that this has been helpful, and that by understanding, the similarities and the differences and the overlaps of trauma and sensitivity can help you fully embrace a new level in your healing. And I hope that these practical tips can also help you to embrace your sensitivity as the gift that it is. I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. So if you would, head over to Instagram and share a message with me and let me know. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of The Collective Healers. Remember, healing is a personal process, and you have the power to create harmony in mind, body, and spirit. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your support helps us reach more listeners who can benefit from these topics. Also, stop over and say hello on Instagram and Facebook. And until next time, I am sending you so much love.